All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. In this video, I'm going to be sharing what goes on in my head as I do practice sketches. So these are meant to be small and quick. The first thing that I want to talk about is a common technique you'll see me do throughout these sketches. You'll notice that I'll put my pen at the end point of a line before I actually draw that line. And you can see me do that here. This does a number of things. It helps me visualize the path that my pen needs to take, but more importantly, it's putting my pen in the final resting spot, and this kind of gives me a little bit of muscle memory to make sure that I can get back to that point easily. Now, I'm going to do a bad technique here that I don't recommend, and that is to push the pen to make a line. I'll do it for the top and bottom of this bump out here, and this is partly me being lazy and partly me testing the control with my pen. Making lines this way can be very inconsistent, and it can definitely lead to major mistakes, so I don't recommend doing this. But what I really should have done instead is to change my hand placement and approach the line from a better angle. But these sketches are really meant for me to try new things and experiment. I know going into these that I'm meant to make mistakes, and that I want to experiment with my drawing. By playing around and trying different things you can do with your pen, you can quickly learn your limitations in how to produce cleaner results. Here's another technique. As I draw this line coming up, I want to be parallel to the one above it. So to do this, I'll start and stop again midway through that line. This just helps me correct the line before I get too far off parallel. I tend to draw lines slower when I use this technique, and sometimes I'll do multiple starts and stops. And you're really not going to get a nice, clean, straight line, but the overall line will be more accurate. At this point in my sketch, I'll start to add window detail. I like the contrast that windows can bring to my sketch, so most of the windows will be colored in to be black. You might notice that on several of the windows, I am not drawing an outline, rather I'm jumping right in and filling the space. There are many reasons for this, but one main reason is that it helps me to be more precise with the scale of my windows. When drawing a shape first, I oftentimes make the mistake of drawing the outline larger than what I want, which, once filled in, causes the final shape to be too big and bulky. By not drawing that outline, I have more control on the scale of that window. Shortly, you'll see me draw that shadow shape, and I try to draw a line to complete the shape, but the angle is a bit difficult for me to reach, so I'll change my approach and come over the top. I'll explain more about why I'm doing this a little later, but it's something that you'll see me do a lot of in these sketches. Now is the fun part. I'm going to draw the hatch lines for the shadows, and I want to draw the lines in the same direction that the shadow is going. That means the lines that I draw for the ground shadows will always point toward the building, and that the hatch lines I draw on the building itself will run down the building into the ground. As I wrap up the line work, I'm going to switch to my markers. I want to use the chisel tip, but watch right here as I struggle to get the direction of the marker tip. What's going on is as I'm picturing the stroke that I want to make, I realize that the broader side will work better. So I'll rotate the marker, I'll switch it up. If you pay attention, you'll see me do this a lot, where I approach a line, but then I switch up my approach because I'm constantly visualizing how that line is going to be drawn before I ever draw it. And when the pen or the marker just doesn't feel right, you'll see me change it up. Okay, I'm going to move over and begin on my second sketch. Now, something I'm doing with most of these sketches is to draw the front corner of the building first. That is going to help me establish the scale for the rest of my drawing. I'll build out my other lines from here, and as I make my way around, I'll add this indent, which is where I'll add this bump out. Now, as I continue to the front of the building, I'm going to draw out most of the general shapes for the front awning. This just now gives me the leftmost edge of my building so that I can draw that line to connect it to my roof. I'm not thinking about any other detail at this point. I want to make sure that my generic shapes are completed. And once they are, I'll start moving over to add windows. Notice how I'm drawing both windows at the same time. This is a useful technique to promote drawing multiple objects in the same perspective. As I continue to add detail, you might notice that I'm getting pretty fidgety with my pen. This comes into play later and I'll talk about that. But at this point, I'm working my way across the sketch, roughing in the detail I think is significant enough to capture. Windows add good contrast to the flat surface, doors can add interest, even this sign adds another level of depth. Pretty much anything to give this more dimensionality. Now's a good time to point out my grip. As I move my hand placement and approach the line from the bottom of the screen here, notice how far back I'm holding that grip. You can't even see my hand in the view. Now, holding the pen that far back will keep my movements loose and promote a quicker, straighter line. It's tough to see this, but if you look carefully, you might notice that I almost have no wrist movement at all. All of the motion is coming from my whole arm. And I'll continue to hold the pen with that loose grip as I add the hatching lines to fill in the shaded areas. Now, in a minute, you'll see me add some more lines to the top roof line. And in order to get the right angle, I'm going to have to move my hand to a more comfortable position. This means that I'm going to have to come over the top of this drawing. Also, if you look close, I'm only using my fingers to move the pen around. By doing this, I'm giving myself a little bit more fine control over the pen. And this is going to help me draw a short line at the correct angle. You may not be able to tell this, but I actually had to stand up to get my hand to rotate enough. Personally, I recommend to rotate my paper, but for these videos, I try and keep my paper stationary, which can sometimes be a challenge. Speaking of challenges, I think a fun challenge you can do for some more practice is to sketch the same building, but try different grip techniques. For example, try a sketch using only a tight grip where all of the line work is controlled with your fingers. And then try that same sketch holding the pen halfway back, but using more of your whole arm to draw with. You'll start to learn more about control you have and the different lines you can produce. Okay, coming up, you'll see an alcohol marker technique. Since I'm using a limited color palette, I don't have a lot of options when it comes to shading. However, watch right here as I go back over this area multiple times with the same shade. This is a great way to build up a darker color with one marker. That's the great thing about these markers, is that they let you do this. Okay, now I want to talk about a bad habit that I have. I like to rotate my pen in my grip, and if you're watching, it comes off as a quick movement, like I'm readjusting my grip, and you can see me do that in 3, 2, 1. Normally, it's not a big deal, but see, I did it again. I rotated my pen when I moved my hand, and as I'm learning, fountain pens don't work well when you use the sides. If you're observant, you'll probably notice that I do this a lot. I'm pretty sure I developed this habit when working with pencils. I would rotate my pencil frequently, almost automatically, to keep that tip sharp and to prevent getting a flat side. Here you're going to see me draw from the bottom, then come in from the side again. But as I stated before, the angle of how you approach a line can really make a difference. Now, I have a tree that blocks this part of the building, so rather than completing my building, I'll take a small detour and draw in that tree. I've talked about how I approach trees in previous videos, but in my mind, I'm thinking about making tiny, loose little triangles that I can never quite complete because I'm moving on to the next one. Once I have that generic shape of the tree complete, I'll move back over to my building to finish it. And I'll come back to the tree later to add detail. One of the many mistakes I did when I was younger, and let's be honest, I probably still do this, is that I would focus too much on the detail, especially in just one area, instead of blocking in major shapes and refining the detail in stages. When I would get too focused on one section of the image, I would oftentimes make it difficult for me to make any adjustments. I wasn't allowing myself to be loose with my sketches. Starting general and refining down allows you the flexibility to adapt to your sketch, especially if you made small mistakes or you were not exact with the line. Okay, here is that window technique again. I'm not drawing the outline, rather I'm just blocking in the total area. It really helps to keep thin windows thin. And now you'll see me draw the tree shadow on the building. This is using the same loose triangle technique I mentioned earlier. And as I switch over to start adding my hatch lines to the shaded areas, you may have noticed that I switched my grip too. Just like I mentioned previously, I'm moving to a looser grip to promote a quicker, straighter line. making sure to run my hatch lines up and down that building. I'll use that loose triangle technique once more to add some detail to the tree so it doesn't look flat. Now I'm going to move over to shading, and what I'm doing is using my light gray marker just to put down the midtones that I'm seeing. Okay, now as I continue shading, you'll notice that I've been using the chisel tip. Once I start with a certain tip, I kind of like to stay with that tip as long as I can, but coming up, you'll see that as I try to go in and shade the tree shadow, I'll realize that the chisel tip is the wrong tip to the job, and I'll switch to the brush tip. Also, I want to point out, rather than shading the tree with broad strokes, I'm actually shading the different sections based on the surfaces of the building that the shadow hits. This just gives me smaller areas to shade, so it's a little more accurate. And since I have the dark gray marker, I'm also going to add some spots of dark gray to the tree to give it some more character. I'm very deliberate about not overshading these sketches. They are meant to be quick and simple, so I try to find a point where I just stop and don't go any farther. Okay, and that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this style of video, and don't forget to give it a like and subscribe.